Hey everybody, what causes unemployment? We're going to have to build a model of the labor market. Every month, more than 5 million people start a new job. Also every month, more than 5 million people leave their jobs. Businesses hire new people and eliminate jobs daily. A dynamic labor market makes it easier for people to find new jobs. There are supply dynamics, workers choosing whether or not to take a job, and there's demand dynamics of whether businesses find it advantageous to hire or not. The labor market's a little different than the output market. Firms are the demanders. Households are the suppliers. And the wage is the price. Vertical axis is wage. Horizontal axis is the quantity of labor. The demand for labor coming from firms is largely dependent on the productivity of the worker. If a worker produces more value, the firm will demand more labor. And what determines the labor supply? People have options. Sometimes they just want to take the time off. They value their leisure. Other times, they could work somewhere else. The number of workers willing to work and the number of workers firms are willing to hire come together to find an equilibrium quantity and wage. There are three main causes of unemployment. Number one is frictional. You might be moving between jobs until you find a suitable position. Maybe you went to a new city to follow a spouse. Maybe you just graduated college and haven't found the right job yet. Maybe you didn't like your previous boss and decided to leave and spend some time searching for a better one. Frictional unemployment is generally a good thing. Searching for jobs takes time. We want employees and employers to get the right match. Don't just take the first thing that comes along. The next is structural unemployment. This is when wages don't fall enough to bring the labor demand and supply into an equilibrium. We say structural because there could be certain rules in society or norms or practices that cause this. We'll get into a little more detail on it. And then the third component, the one we really want to eliminate always and everywhere, is cyclical unemployment. This is caused during a recession. Firms are no longer as profitable as they used to be. Many businesses go bankrupt, and that labor demand plummets, causing a significant decrease in the total equilibrium quantity of labor in a market. Let's talk about Henry Ford and the efficiency wage hypothesis. An efficiency wage is a higher wage paid in order to encourage greater worker productivity. Efficiency wages can cause structural unemployment, but it can also lower the total labor cost. Let's see what I mean. In 1913, Ford's Highland Park factory reported a 10% absentee rate. So every day, 10% of his employees wouldn't show up for work and would be sick. Now, I'm sure a handful were, but the big pandemic flu didn't hit till the end of that decade. And they also saw a 370% turnover rate, meaning for every single job in the assembly line, they had to rehire that position 3.7 times every year. That's too much. To reduce this turnover, Henry Ford introduced the $5 a day wage. It doubled the pay of his 25,000 auto workers. Was he being generous? Not necessarily. He was able to have a more productive plant, which in turn increased his profits in the long run. So efficiency wages are very interesting. It changes the bargaining of it. It's going to be a wage above the regular equilibrium, and it will cause structural unemployment. So the old equilibrium wage is as follows, but an efficiency wage across the board can prevent us from reaching equilibrium. Well, what's the consequence? When you have a higher structural wage, the quantity of labor supply is bigger than the quantity of labor demanded, and you get some unemployment. Now, whether or not this is a good thing or not depends. A lot of structural unemployment can be caused by things like minimum wage laws. The wage is too high, it can't go down enough to clear the market. Or it could be unemployment insurance. You're paying some people not to work. Or it could be a particular union structure that keeps wages higher than what the market clearing would allow. Or it could be hiring and firing practices. Maybe it's not very easy to let workers go, and so firms are hesitant to hire workers in the first place. When we take a snapshot of the labor market in Europe, we see some differences across countries. Generally speaking, Northern Europe has a relatively lower unemployment rate compared to Southern Europe, and some of this is caused by labor laws that don't allow firms to hire and fire quickly. As a side note, Ukraine is the most notable on the map, but that's largely caused by the cyclical unemployment due to Russia's aggressive invasion. There's another lesson to be reached by this graph. There's nothing guaranteed about that old equilibrium wage that requires it to be at a living level. To see what I mean, take the worker. If a worker doesn't work, and that's the only opportunity they have for income, they die. No food on the table, no shelter, no nothing. So in that environment, what's the minimum they'd be willing to work? At a wage just enough to pay for a few calories. So in society, we say that people shouldn't experience that. We establish social safety nets, food stamps, subsidized housing, etc. And therefore workers aren't going to be willing to go out and work for $1 an hour in today's money. But what determines labor demand? The value added of a worker for a given product. What if the value of a given product is too low relative to the required wage to pay workers to get out there? A market by itself may not reach that equilibrium. But let's look at a few of these policies take it to the real world data, and see whether or not they actually affect unemployment or not. The question about minimum wage, for example, has received a tremendous amount of attention over the past 30 years. There are dozens and dozens of studies that have tried to do so. The basic strategy is that one state will increase their minimum wage, whereas the state next door will not. You take a look at some border towns and see what happened to the unemployment rate. This graph over here takes an overview of these data, looking at international evidence across the world. That dotted black line in the middle is 0, meaning that if a study is in there, there is no employment effect. Changing the minimum wage laws has no effect on employment. And what we find if we look at the confidence intervals of these studies, that nearly all of them include 0. There's a handful, this one and a few down here, that find a negative employment effect, and then there's one or two like this one that find a statistically positive employment effect. In other words, the historical changes in the minimum wages we've seen have not caused any significant unemployment. This finding's really interesting. There is a publication bias in the research. It's harder to publish papers that get a positive employment effect. And you can see that here. All of these dots represent all of the different employment effects from changes in the minimum wage. We would expect to see a symmetric statistical distribution. But if you notice, there's a bit of a gap on the positive side, meaning it is more difficult to get a positive employment finding published in the peer-reviewed journals. Once we correct for this missing bit, we no longer find that negative effect. If you're interested in learning more about the scholarly research on minimum wage, I would strongly recommend this paper, The Elusive Employment Effect of Minimum Wage by Alan Manning. And if you see that word complimentary, that means it's free for everybody. Finally, I want to end emphasizing the importance of addressing unemployment rate. There is a social cost to this. Some unemployment is normal. We want people to take time to search for the right job, but persistent structural unemployment can bring negative consequences. Number 1, you can get hysteresis. This is when high unemployment leads to higher equilibrium unemployment rate. What do we mean by this? Number 1, children of unemployed parents get less resources, thus increasing the odds of poverty and unemployment in the future. But for individuals, long stretches of unemployment create a self-reinforcing cycle. The longer the unemployment time, the harder it is to find a job. And for the government, the unemployment population is more likely to experience morbidity, depression, and have a lower life expectancy. And unemployment can increase government spending with social insurance. And higher unemployment is associated with less tax revenue. So how do we address it? During an unemployment spell, federal and state governments provide unemployment insurance. Generally, this means for a temporary duration, the government will provide a check to subsidize your missing income. It's usually a smaller fraction than your regular paycheck, in order to incentivize you to return to work once the opportunity arises. Nevertheless, many people ask, does unemployment insurance cause unemployment? Let's go over the economic research from the past decade. This graph comes from a paper published in 2016. The horizontal axis represents the current labor market conditions. If we're in a recession, we'll have a higher unemployment rate. The vertical axis represents the response of a longer unemployment duration from a more generous unemployment insurance. And the paper finds that increasing unemployment insurance when we're in a recession, so we're on the right-hand side of the graph, does not increase the duration of the unemployment spell. In other words, paying people when they're not working is not going to cause them to not work when there isn't work out there to begin with. But when times are good, and there are plenty of jobs out there, the effect of unemployment insurance can be more negative. And there's lots of papers that have found this result. This particular one, Unemployment Insurance Generosity and Aggregate Employment, looks at the housing crisis in 2009. There is no statistically significant impact of increasing unemployment generosity on aggregate employment. 10 years later, during the pandemic, politicians did learn a lesson. They were criticized during the financial crisis for not helping out Main Street as generously as they helped out Wall Street. And so, in 2020, they drastically expanded unemployment insurance so that many people were receiving more money on unemployment insurance than they were receiving even on their job. And so, a year later in 2021, many states decided to refuse that federal money, but other states decided to keep it, thus giving us a natural experiment to compare which one had a better employment outcome. The expiration of the temporary $600 boost to weekly unemployment benefits under the federal pandemic unemployment compensation led to little impact of job gains from benefit reduction. And this isn't the only paper that found that. A February 21 literature review of the impacts of increased unemployment insurance said that this generosity has spurred a lot of discussion on whether such high benefits would reduce workers' willingness to go back to work because they suddenly make more than their previous wage. This is not the case. Return to work and employment rates were not lower in states where UI benefits expansion was larger. Looking specifically at the meatpacking jobs, this paper by one of my colleagues here at WSU found the additional unemployment benefits of the CARES CARES Act neither deterred nor encouraged respondents' willingness to accept a job. Now, there are a few papers that did find a negative employment effect. However, it is small. This one finds that the national unemployment rate in each of July and August would have been around 0.3 percentage points lower than they were. But they also present evidence that the early termination caused financial hardship in 5% of the households. The welfare implications of the early termination of this expanded unemployment insurance are therefore ambiguous. So, does unemployment insurance cause unemployment? No. Why? Well, it's temporary, but a job is permanent. And once you get that return to work offer, there's uncertainty about when that would expire. It's hard to tell your boss, wait, I've got this generous unemployment insurance. It's going to last another 3 months. Can we just start working 4 months from now? Your boss might not go for that plan. Better take the job now. And that's what people did. There's also the possibility of future wage losses. The longer the spell of unemployment, the longer the losses in future earnings. And these incentives came together to prevent any major negative effects from expanded unemployment insurance. In the end, we found that generous unemployment insurance is one of the best stimuluses we have during a recession. Number one, it's targeted. It's going exactly to the group that needs it the most. And number two, it's an effective stimulus. People just don't save it under a mattress. They go out and spend, helping boost the economic activity. And number three, we simply don't find robust negative effects.